Are all sins equal? Well, the obvious answer is no, they're not. Yeah, you often hear Christians talk about how all sins are equal. And normally what they're trying to do is downplay a very serious sin that someone has committed. And they're basically saying, look, what I did is no more worse than you. We're all guilty. Well, they're partly right, but they're very much wrong in this. Listen to what Jesus had to say about sin and its degrees. Here in John chapter 16, verse 11, it says, Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Well, now, if all sins were equal, why does Jesus talk about a greater sin? And what he's saying is, you soldiers, you're guilty, or the Roman government is guilty, the Jewish Sanhedrin is guilty, but Judas Iscariot is the greater one who's guilty. So Jesus does talk about degrees of sin. Even Jesus gives parables to illustrate the degrees of punishment. He says some will be beaten with a few blows and some will be beaten with many blows. Well, there's degrees of punishment in hell. There's degrees of punishment in this earth. And so Jesus himself talks about many and a few blows. Then the apostle Paul writes in 1 John chapter 6, he says, brothers and sisters, verse 1, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore the person gently, but watch yourself so that you may not be tempted. Wait a minute. If all sins were equal, how do we even apply Galatians 6, verse 1? Obviously, there's a particular sin that has so robbed a person of his walk with God that he needs restoration. So again, all sins, if you mean that any one sin can send you to hell, that's right. And we're all guilty of it. And that's why the story of the woman caught in adultery is so beautiful. She's committed a grave sin, right? But what does Jesus say? He that's without sin cast the first stone. And of course, everyone dropped their rocks because we're all sinners. So if you want to say that any one sin can send you to hell, that all of us are sinners, whether it's Hitler, who killed millions of people, or a dear housewife who tries to be a good mother, but she rejects Jesus, they're all going to hell. But don't tell me that the housewife is going to have the same degrees of whippings and punishment than Hitler's going to have. No, what Hitler did was even worse. So there are consequences of sin. We find in John in 1 John chapter 5, he says, if you see a brother or sister commit a sin that does not lead to death, you shall pray and God will give him life. There is a sin that does lead to death. I'm not saying he should pray for that person. Pray about that. So, again, there is a sin that leads to death. We call it mortal sin. This is a sin that has incredible consequences to it. And so, in answer to the question, are all sins equal? No, they're not. Some have greater consequences. Let's take sexual sins for a moment. Fornication is a sin. Two single people having sex outside of marriage, they've sinned. But the adulterer has a greater sin, because that's a person sleeping with someone else's spouse or is cheating on their spouse. That person has a greater sin. But then take it further. A pedophile has a greater sin than an adulterer. They're taking advantage of a child. That's a greater sin. And then we can talk about natural sexual actions and unnatural ones. Those even have consequences that might be greater than fornication and adultery. What I'm trying to tell you is all sin can separate you from God, and all of us need a Savior, and none of us are without sin. But to teach that all sins are equal with equal consequences, that is an unbiblical notion, nor does it make sense. I hope I've answered your question.